What happens when a single night in the Caribbean suddenly feels like the opening scene of a regional war? The silence breaks first, not with missiles, not with speeches, but with the low, rising hum of engines from a distant horizon. Radar operators along Venezuela's northern coast stare at screens glowing with new signatures. Naval analysts at U.S. Southern Command monitor satellite feeds showing armored vehicles rolling into coastal defensive positions. And above the water, the shadow of the world's largest warship cuts across moonlit waves like a steel omen of what may come next. Across the Caribbean Sea, tension is no longer a rumor. It is visible, measurable, undeniable. Venezuela has mobilized 200,000 soldiers, activated coastal missile batteries, and placed its air force on high alert moves President Nicolas Maduro describes as essential for national survival. Meanwhile, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the most powerful aircraft carrier ever constructed, pushes deeper into the region, escorted by a constellation of warships, submarines, reconnaissance aircraft, and a full air wing primed for rapid deployment. Washington frames the deployment as a mission to ensure maritime security and freedom of navigation, a statement consistent with language found in Reuters and BBC reporting on U.S. strategic operations in contested regions. Yet timing speaks louder than official lines. The United States under President Donald Trump has redirected strategic attention toward the Western Hemisphere, citing concerns about Russian and Iranian military cooperation with Caracas. Defense News notes that U.S. naval planners view the Caribbean as a pivotal artery for global shipping lanes and energy transit, an area where the projection of power is both symbolic and strategic. But to Venezuelan commanders, none of this looks like routine presence. Satellite imagery verified by multiple international outlets shows Arleigh Burke-class destroyers maneuvering into strike-capable positions and a Ticonderoga-class cruiser shifting closer to operational range. These vessels carry Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of deep penetration into Venezuelan territory, a capability that fundamentally changes the psychology of the standoff. For Caracas, these moves evoke memories of past U.S. interventions in Latin America. For Washington, the buildup is a reminder that geopolitical influence, especially in a region long considered within America's strategic perimeter, cannot be ceded without consequence. Both narratives collide over the same stretch of tropical water, turning the Caribbean into a geopolitical fault line. From a cinematic vantage point, the contrast is striking. On one side, Venezuela's coastline, crowded with soldiers, armored vehicles, and anti-aircraft units hastily repositioned in the sand. On the other, a floating airbase carrying more than 70 aircraft, FA-18 Super Hornets, EA-18 Growlers, and E-2 Hawkeyes preparing for coordinated flight patterns. Below deck, thousands of sailors operate inside one of the most complex military machines on Earth, a vessel designed not merely to deter conflict, but to dominate its early hours. Drone feeds from Puerto Rico and Curacao, spotted by regional aviation trackers and mentioned in DW's recent defense analyses, show MQ-9 Reapers conducting persistent surveillance over maritime corridors. These unmanned platforms supply real-time intelligence tracking Venezuelan troop deployments and naval patrols. Every movement becomes data, every signal becomes a variable in a rapidly tightening equation. Then comes the question that no one can answer. Is this posturing or preparation? Maduro's government calls the U.S. deployment an imminent threat. U.S. officials insist the intention is deterrence, not invasion. Yet signals intelligence and air traffic logs reveal patterns that mirror pre-positioning seen in other active conflict zones, such as the Israeli-Iranian drone escalation and U.S.-China tension in the South China Sea. In these regions, modern military crises do not begin with declarations, they begin with build-up shadows and ambiguities. The Caribbean now fits that pattern. As night deepens, the Ford's flight deck illuminates under white and amber lights. Crew chiefs signal aircraft into position. Pilots review mission packets. Naval commanders monitor encrypted communications bouncing between destroyers and reconnaissance aircraft. On Venezuelan soil artillery batteries receive orders to maintain readiness through the night. The rhythm of preparation becomes the heartbeat of the region. Yet behind these movements lies a deeper question about power itself. Who controls the Caribbean in the 21st century? The answer is no longer guaranteed. For the first time in years, a U.S. strike group and a fully mobilized Venezuelan military confront one another in real time, each believing the other might make the first irreversible move. And so, the opening chapter of this crisis unfolds not with explosions, but with tension thick enough to change the political gravity of the entire hemisphere. The first hint that the balance of power had shifted came not from the carrier itself, but from the aircraft circling far above the Caribbean. Long before the USS Gerald R. Ford appeared on the horizon, intelligence analysts detected B-52 Stratofortresses and B-1 Lancer bombers conducting wide-arc patrols, aircraft never deployed lightly and never without purpose. Their presence alone transformed the standoff from a regional dispute into a scenario with global implications. When bombers enter the picture, calculations change, timelines shrink, missteps become existential. Washington's official explanation echoed familiar lines about deterrence readiness and regional security language, consistent with past statements highlighted by Reuters in coverage of US deployments near contested regions. But the hardware told a different story. The Ford Strike Group did not resemble a symbolic show of force. It resembled the opening configuration of a war plan. Accompanying the carrier were Arleigh Burke-class destroyers designed for anti-air, anti-surface, and land attack missions, along with a Ticonderoga-class cruiser carrying upwards of 120 missiles. Each vessel's loadout, Tomahawks, SM-6 Interceptors, ESSMs, signaled an ability to conduct simultaneous offense and defense, a capability Venezuela could not hope to match. And beneath the surface lurked what neither side openly acknowledged: US nuclear-powered attack submarines. BBC defense analysts frequently note that these vessels are often the first to arrive during crises, providing covert surveillance and the option for preemptive strikes. Their silence is their threat, their invisibility is their advantage. Above this invisible theater, another layer of American power took shape. The Ford's Air Wing, more than 70 aircraft operated as a self-contained ecosystem of attack surveillance and electronic warfare. FA-18 Super Hornets trained in tight formations, simulating suppression of coastal defenses. EA-18 Growlers emitted electronic signatures designed to blind enemy radar. E-2 Hawkeyes created a 360-degree air picture, detecting any aircraft or missile rising from Venezuelan territory. These operations, observed by regional trackers and confirmed in international reporting, mirrored flight patterns used in previous US operations in the Middle East and Western Pacific. But it was the presence of F-35 Lightning II jets in Puerto Rico that sent the clearest message. Stealth aircraft do not deploy for deterrence alone, they deploy when rapid dominance is required. Defense News has repeatedly described the F-35 as the Pentagon's first-minute asset, meaning it is meant to strike before the enemy even realizes a conflict has begun. Their radar-evading profiles and long-range precision capabilities effectively guaranteed US air superiority should hostilities erupt. And yet the American buildup did not stop with jets and warships. It extended into the very structure of the Caribbean battle space. P-8 Poseidon aircraft scanned for submarines, ensuring no foreign-flagged vessels, particularly from Russia, could interfere. MQ-9 Reaper drones traced Venezuelan troop positions across coastal states. AC-130J Ghost Rider gunships, the most heavily armed in the US inventory, orbited silently waiting for orders. Each of these platforms represented a different tier of escalation. Together they formed a web of dominance. Within this network, the Ford functioned as a blend of spearhead and shield, an instrument of overwhelming force, but also of strategic messaging. Trump administration officials emphasized the need to restore hemispheric stability, invoking arguments similar to those seen in DW and Guardian analyses on US approaches to Latin American crises. Their tone implied urgency, even inevitability. Washington viewed the region as a geopolitical fault line vulnerable to Russian and Iranian influence. Caracas saw the same deployments as preparation for an invasion masked by diplomatic ambiguity. Meanwhile, US Marines aboard amphibious assault ships rehearsed what military doctrine calls literal entry operations, the very maneuvers required to seize beachheads under fire. The Iwo Jima and other amphibious ships carried vehicles and personnel designed not for observation but for taking ground. Helicopters such as the Viper and Venom flew in escort patterns identical to those used in recent Middle East engagements. These were not defensive postures, they were projections of intent. With each passing day, the Caribbean began to resemble other modern conflict theaters. The dense intelligence grid mirrored the skies over eastern Ukraine. The layered naval presence resembled US maneuvers around the Taiwan Strait. The bomber deployments evoked the pre-strike choreography often seen before Israeli operations against Iranian targets. In all these cases, escalation emerged not from speeches, but from capability raw, visible, undeniable capability. And so the central question grew heavier. Was the United States preparing for conflict or preparing Venezuela to fear one? The difference mattered less than the perception, because in the fog of modern geopolitics, perception can trigger miscalculation, and miscalculation can ignite war. The Ford's engines continued to churn, flight crews continued their drills, and the Caribbean, once defined by warm trade winds and quiet nights, now pulsed with the unmistakable heartbeat of American military power ready for its next move. Venezuela's response came faster than many analysts in Washington and Brussels expected. As U.S. naval forces tightened their posture in the Caribbean, Caracas initiated its largest military mobilization in decades. 200,000 soldiers activated coastal battalions, redeployed air defense crews placed on round-the-clock readiness, and naval patrols ordered into contested waters. What appeared at first glance to be a symbolic gesture soon revealed itself as a full-spectrum defensive operation. This was not a drill, it was preparation for the unthinkable. President Nicolas Maduro framed the mobilization as an act of national sovereignty, a shield against foreign aggression, according to statements circulated on state media. But beyond domestic rhetoric, international defense observers recognize something deeper fear. Not panic, but strategic fear, the kind that drives nations to overcommit, overprepare, and sometimes overstep. Reuters' analysis on Venezuelan security policy has often emphasized how Caracas views U.S. military presence through the lens of historic interventionism. And in the Trump era, with Washington openly condemning Venezuelan ties to Russia and Iran, those concerns only escalated. Venezuela's military buildup began along its northern coastline, the most likely axis of a U.S. amphibious landing. Units from the Bolivarian army deployed armored vehicles, short-range ballistic systems, and anti-aircraft platforms, including the Russian-supplied Buk M2 and older S-125 Pechora batteries. These systems, while aging, posed a limited threat to low-altitude aircraft and unprotected transport vehicles. For Caracas, the goal was not to match U.S. firepower, an impossible task, but to raise the cost of any potential strike. Alongside these movements, the Venezuelan Navy sent patrol boats and corvettes into the Caribbean, though their presence offered little beyond symbolism. U.S. destroyers could outrange and outgun them from well beyond the horizon, yet symbolism mattered. Each vessel that left port signaled the same message: Venezuela would not yield its coastline without resistance. Behind the visible positioning, a quieter form of preparation unfolded. Intelligence reports cited by BBC and Al Jazeera noted increased coordination between Venezuelan military officers and foreign advisors, particularly from Russia's security apparatus. Cyber teams shifted to enhanced readiness, preparing to counter electronic warfare likely to accompany any U.S. first strike. Communications bunkers were reinforced. Air bases moved fuel reserves into hardened shelters. The mobilization became a national ritual, soldiers marching civilians, watching commanders insisting that destiny favored resistance. Still, reality cast a long shadow. Venezuelan air power, weakened by years of economic collapse, lacked operational depth. Its fleet of Su-30 Mk2 flankers, once the pride of its air force, struggled with spare parts shortages. Its radar network, though recently upgraded with Iranian assistance, could not match the electronic dominance of U.S. Growlers, Poseidons, and F-35s. Every analyst from DW's defense correspondents to Guardian regional experts understood the asymmetry. Venezuela could mobilize bodies, but the United States controlled the sky. Yet Caracas believed it had won ace alliances. For years, Russia had supplied training and equipment. Iran had expanded drone and surveillance cooperation. China had quietly invested in telecommunications and dual-use technologies. While none of these nations were expected to intervene directly, their support offered Maduro political cover and a sense of strategic insulation. The risk misplaced confidence. As U.S. forces advanced, Venezuela interpreted every maneuver as confirmation of a looming invasion. Meanwhile, Washington viewed Venezuelan mobilization as proof of hostile intent. This mirrored conditions in other global flashpoints: Ukraine, where force buildups preceded conflict; Israel and Iran, where every deployment is viewed through a lens of existential threat; the South China Sea, where patrols often generate escalation spirals neither side originally intended. The Caribbean crisis now fit this same geopolitical template, two actors reading the worst possible intentions in the other's every move. Inside Venezuela, the human dimension intensified. Families stocked food, airports experienced disruptions, fuel shortages worsened as the government prioritized military logistics. Soldiers slept in coastal trenches under thick, humid air. Mothers worried about conscript sons. Fathers feared the return of war to a region that had not seen large-scale conflict in a generation. Even those who supported Maduro understood the magnitude of what was unfolding. Venezuela was standing up to the hemisphere's most powerful military. But the question persisted, could it withstand the consequences? For every mobilized battalion, the United States surged another platform. For every Venezuelan defensive posture, the United States adjusted targeting patterns on ships, submarines, and aircraft. Venezuela was preparing for battle. The United States was preparing options. And between these two preparations lay the danger that defines modern conflict, the moment when readiness becomes escalation, and escalation becomes irreversibility. Strategists across Washington, Brussels, and Tel Aviv began drawing the same conclusion: the Caribbean crisis did not stand alone. It formed part of a wider global pattern, a chain of simultaneous flashpoints stretching from Ukraine to the Middle East to the South China Sea. Each theater carried different actors, different weapons, different histories, yet the underlying dynamic was identical: great powers testing the limits of influence while regional states absorbed the consequences. Analysts from Reuters and DW warned that what unfolded near Venezuela echoed the broader unraveling of global stability, a world where deterrence looked increasingly indistinguishable from preparation for war. To understand the unfolding crisis, many observers pointed first to Ukraine, where years of buildup and counter-buildup had normalized the presence of massive troop movements along contested borders. Russia's mobilization near Kharkiv, NATO's reinforcement of Eastern Europe, and the persistent drone and artillery exchanges across the front had shown the world that modern conflicts rarely begin with declarations. They begin with positioning. The same pattern now appeared in the Caribbean. The United States deployed a strike group capable of projecting overwhelming force. Venezuela mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops. Neither side announced intent, but both sides prepared for the worst. This cold symmetry of movement mirroring Ukraine's deadly choreography became a warning sign. Trump administration security officials referencing NATO's lessons from Eastern Europe suggested that hesitation invites escalation from rival powers. Meanwhile, Maduro's government observed Ukraine's fate as evidence of why smaller states must harden early before an adversary exploits weakness. Each interpretation justified further readiness. Each justification fueled the crisis. Then came the Middle Eastern comparison. Israel and Iran, locked in a proxy and shadow conflict, had demonstrated how rapidly crises escalate when aircraft missile launches and cyber intrusions are interpreted as existential threats. In April 2025, Israeli airstrikes targeting Iranian drone depots triggered retaliatory missile volleys, placing the region on the edge of a wider war. That confrontation taught global observers that ambiguity, uncertainty about who struck first or why could be as dangerous as open hostility. The Caribbean began to adopt the same psychological terrain. US bombers patrolling near Venezuelan airspace resembled Israeli long-range signaling flights. Venezuelan radar lock-ons, brief and inconsistent, resembled Iranian defensive posturing. And the presence of Russian and Iranian advisors in Caracas created an unmistakable echo of Middle Eastern entanglements. The Guardian noted that the geopolitical threads connecting these conflicts formed a strategic tapestry of mirrored behaviors, one misstep in one region increasing tensions in all others. But perhaps the most alarming parallel came from US-China tensions in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. There, close encounters between ships and aircraft had become almost routine. Chinese warplanes flying near Taiwan's airspace, US destroyers conducting freedom of navigation patrols, and PLA Navy vessels shadowing American carriers all contributed to an environment where the margin between deterrence and disaster was razor thin. DW analysts emphasized a single unifying principle: when major powers operate in close proximity with incompatible political aims, crises become self-reinforcing. That principle now ruled the Caribbean. Venezuela viewed the United States through the same lens Taiwan viewed China, an overwhelmingly powerful neighbor whose intentions could shift suddenly. The United States viewed Venezuela through the same lens Israel viewed Iran, an adversarial state aligned with rival powers and capable of destabilizing a strategic region. Both perceptions generated the same response: readiness, and readiness in turn generated fear. The more Venezuela prepared, the more Washington detected signs of aggression. The more Washington surged assets, the more Caracas believed invasion was imminent. This loop mirrored the destabilizing cycles seen in every other global flashpoint of 2025. And yet this crisis carried its own unique twist. The Western Hemisphere had not experienced a near-peer standoff of this magnitude in decades. The presence of a US supercarrier amphibious assault ships, stealth jets, nuclear submarines, and long-range bombers so close to a Latin American coastline transformed the region into a strategic mirror of distant conflicts, bringing the same risks home. Reuters commentators argued that the Trump administration faced a difficult balance, projecting American dominance without appearing to provoke conflict. Meanwhile, Venezuelan officials insisted that resisting U.S. pressure served not just national pride, but global multipolarity, aligning themselves rhetorically with Russia, Iran, and China. BBC reporting described this language as part defiance, part desperation. Through these interpretations, the crisis gained global weight. It was no longer simply a dispute over sovereignty or military posturing. It became an extension of global competition, a node in a worldwide network of strategic rivalries where each local action carried global consequences. As the world watched the Caribbean tighten into a compressed theater of opposing powers, one unsettling realization grew clearer. The patterns seen in Ukraine, Israel, Iran, and the US-China rivalry were not warnings, they were blueprints. If history rhymed, the next phase would not be diplomacy, but escalation. And the question looming over every capital became the same one whispered in defense ministries worldwide. If the world's fault lines have begun to merge, how close is the next collision? Long before missiles fly or ships collide, it is ordinary people who feel the first tremors of a looming conflict. In Venezuela, the human cost began quietly. Empty supermarket aisles, fuel lines curling for blocks, families debating whether to flee inland or stay near home. Soldiers marched to coastal positions while mothers whispered prayers over packed bags. The buildup may have been military in appearance, but its impact spread deeply into civilian life. Panic purchases surged. Pharmacies rationed medicine. Electricity outages grew more frequent as energy was diverted to secure military installations. Reuters correspondents on the ground noted that even rumors of war reshaped daily routines, as if the population collectively braced for a storm building offshore. For the 200,000 Venezuelan troops ordered to mobilize the crisis carried an even harsher reality. Many deployed with limited equipment, outdated radios, or aging armored vehicles conditions worsened by years of economic crisis. The duty they faced was monumental, defending coastlines against a U.S. strike force capable of dominating air and sea within hours. Commanders hardened their speeches with language of patriotism and destiny, but the soldiers themselves carried quieter fears. Would their weapons work? Would reinforcements arrive? Would the world support them, or would they stand alone against overwhelming might? Across the Caribbean, another kind of tension gripped local populations in islands like Puerto Rico, Curacao, and Trinidad. The presence of U.S. aircraft F-35 stealth jets, P-8 Poseidons, Reaper drones brought a mix of security and unease. Some saw these deployments as protection, others saw them as magnets for danger. Tourism declined sharply as visitors canceled flights. Fishermen reported sightings of naval vessels emerging like shadows on the horizon. The Guardian highlighted that many island economies already strained by inflation and climate pressures feared that even a limited conflict would devastate livelihoods built on fragile supply chains. Inside the United States, the human dimension manifested differently. Military families watched the news with familiar dread carrier deployments, bomber patrol routes, escalating rhetoric, all too reminiscent of earlier conflicts. While the Trump administration reassured the public that deployments were precautionary, the scale told its own story. When the Ford Carrier Strike Group moves into contested waters, when B-52s and B-1s circle the region, citizens understand what such signals mean. They have seen similar buildups in Iraq, Syria, and the Western Pacific. Each time the pattern remains unmistakable. Meanwhile, Venezuelan civilians living near oil facilities and coastal bases wondered whether they were unknowingly standing near future targets. BBC analysts warned that U.S. strategy in previous conflicts often focused on disabling military infrastructure, early airfields, radar stations, fuel depots. If a strike occurred, blasts could ripple through nearby communities. Residents prepared evacuation routes, though many lacked vehicles or fuel to use them. Beyond the physical risks, the psychological toll deepened. Social media became a battlefield of its own. Rumors of imminent invasion spread hourly. Fake satellite images circulated. Anonymous accounts posted warnings of chemical attacks, naval landings, or foreign mercenaries. DW reported that Venezuelan citizens struggled to distinguish fact from manipulation as digital propaganda intensified. Fear grew not only from what might happen, but from what could no longer be verified. Economic consequences tightened the pressure. The belaver weakened further against global currencies. Food imports stalled. Shipping companies rerouted vessels to avoid the Caribbean. Even neighboring Colombia and Brazil braced for spillover effects. Mass migration refugee flows disrupted trade corridors. For them, the standoff represented not just a geopolitical shift, but a humanitarian threat looming across their borders. Venezuela's poorest communities, the barrios perched on hillsides overlooking Caracas, felt the strain most sharply. Aid groups warned that any conflict, even a short one, would collapse already fragile distribution networks. Children depended on subsidized school meals. Hospitals faced shortages of antibiotics and equipment. A single miscalculation at sea or in the air could push millions into deeper crisis. The human stakes extended to the military personnel on both sides. US sailors aboard the Ford trained for precision and readiness, yet carried the weight of knowing that a single misunderstanding with Venezuelan radar operators could thrust them into combat. Marines aboard amphibious assault ships reviewed landing procedures, maps, distances, objectives, fully aware that storming a defended coast, even one with outdated infrastructure, carried immense risk. And beneath all of this lay a larger, more existential question. How much control do ordinary people truly have when geopolitical forces collide above them? Venezuelans did not choose the strategic rivalry between Washington and Moscow. Caribbean islanders did not decide the deployment of stealth jets and nuclear submarines. American families did not ask for their loved ones to sail toward another potential conflict zone. Yet their futures now hung in the balance. The world often views military crises through maps, troop numbers, and missile ranges. But behind every statistic stands a family making decisions in fear, decisions about safety, survival, and uncertainty. In the Caribbean crisis, human vulnerability became the thread connecting every action, every deployment, every signal. Because long before the first shot is fired, wars begin in the minds and lives of the people who fear they may not survive them. And as the tension escalated, one chilling truth settled across the region. If diplomacy fails, it will not be governments that pay the first price. It will be the people caught in the middle. As the standoff entered its most unstable phase, the silence between movements became as important as the movements themselves. The USS Gerald R. Ford continued its slow, deliberate trajectory through the Caribbean, flanked by destroyers capable of unleashing precision strikes deep into Venezuelan territory. Onshore Venezuelan forces dug in along coastal ridges, expecting that if war came, it would come hard and fast. Air defense units calibrated systems through the night, their crews listening for the faintest hum of approaching jets. It was a tableau suspended in tension, a region holding its breath. What made this moment uniquely dangerous was not the firepower assembled, but the ambiguity surrounding its purpose. US officials insisted, as they had to Reuters and BBC, that the deployments sought only to promote regional stability and deter the flow of illicit arms and narcotics. But this language, familiar from past crises, carried new weight amid a world already stretched thin by conflict. Trump administration advisors, echoing analyses from DW, argued that American credibility required unmistakable shows of force, especially with Russia and Iran supporting Caracas. Venezuela countered that such narratives masked the real intention coercion regime pressure, perhaps even the early phase of a plan to overthrow Maduro. The truth remained hidden behind diplomatic caution, classified briefings, and military logistics orders. Yet one reality was clear: both sides had crossed thresholds that could not be easily reversed. The presence of B-52 bombers, B-1 Lancers, and AC-130 Ghost Riders near the region signaled operational readiness far beyond deterrence. So did the positioning of F-35 stealth fighters in Puerto Rico, and the persistent surveillance by MQ-9 Reapers and P-8 Poseidon aircraft. US commanders had built a layered grid of dominant sea-air cyber and intelligence designed to shape the first critical hours of any conflict. Meanwhile, Venezuela's mobilization of 200,000 soldiers, coastal batteries, naval patrols, and national militia units created an unmistakable posture the country expected an attack. In global capitals, analysts debated whether this posture mirrored the dangerous brinkmanship witnessed in Ukraine in 2022, the Israel-Iran shadow conflict, or the US-China naval escalations in the Taiwan Strait. Guardian correspondents noted that each of these flashpoints shared the same characteristic: once opposing forces arranged themselves in close proximity with incompatible objectives, even minor frictions risked igniting major war. A radar lock-on, a drone mistaken for a missile, a patrol vessel approaching too quickly. History had shown that these sparks rarely stayed small. Yet despite the buildup, both nations understood the cost of war. For the United States, an invasion of Venezuela would demand enormous resources and could destabilize hemispheric relationships, especially at a moment when Washington needed unity to counter challenges from Beijing and Moscow. For Venezuela, conflict with the world's most powerful military could mean catastrophic losses, political collapse, and humanitarian disaster. DW analysts warned that both sides risked strategic self-destruction if they allowed the crisis to slip into armed confrontation. confrontation. Still, crises rarely follow logic alone, they follow momentum. Every day the Ford Strike Group remained in Caribbean waters, momentum shifted toward a potential flashpoint. Every new Venezuelan fortification, every fresh battalion sent to the coast deepened the commitment to confrontation. Every diplomatic silence widened the chasm between intention and perception. In such conditions, peace becomes fragile, not because war is desired, but because no side wants to appear weak by stepping back. The danger extended far beyond the US and Venezuela. Colombia, Brazil, and Caribbean island states braced for humanitarian spillover, mass migration, and economic shockwaves. Oil markets watched nervously, knowing how easily conflict could disrupt regional production. Energy analysts from Reuters warned that even a limited naval skirmish could spike global prices, worsening inflation already affecting Europe, North America, and Asia. And civilians on both sides, families in Caracas, sailors aboard American vessels, residents of coastal towns from Trinidad to Aruba lived beneath the weight of decisions being made far above them. They were the ones who understood with visceral clarity what policymakers often reduce to strategy wars are not fought on maps. They are fought in homes, cities, and futures. As tensions crested, international observers asked the question that no leader wanted to answer publicly. What happens if the wrong decision is made in the wrong minute? The question lingered in briefing rooms, embassy corridors, naval command centers. It lingered in the humid night air above the Caribbean Sea, carried on the wind between two forces waiting for signals that had not yet come. Because in the end, the crisis distilled into one final haunting uncertainty. Will this standoff become another chapter of global rivalry, or the spark that lights a conflict the Western Hemisphere has not seen in generations? The world waited, the engines of war waited, and somewhere between strategy and miscalculation lay the fate of millions. The Caribbean crisis erupts as Venezuela mobilizes 200,000 troops, while the United States deploys the USS Gerald R. Ford long-range bombers, stealth fighter submarines, and a full strike group into the region. Venezuela views the buildup as preparation for an invasion. Washington frames it as deterrence and maritime security. Intensive military movements, rehearsed amphibious operations, and overlapping surveillance grids create a volatile environment echoing global flashpoints from Ukraine to the Israel-Iran conflict and US-China tensions in the Pacific. Venezuelan forces deploy along the coastline with aging but determined defenses supported indirectly by Russia, Iran, and China. US forces build layered dominance capable of immediate precision strikes and air superiority. Civilians across Venezuela and Caribbean islands face economic disruption fear and misinformation, while US military families brace for another potential conflict zone. Both sides understand the catastrophic cost of war, yet momentum drives them toward increasing readiness. The crisis becomes both a regional standoff and a reflection of worldwide geopolitical competition. As deployments tighten and diplomatic signals remain muted, the world confronts a final unsettling question: will restraint prevail, or will a single miscalculation ignite a hemispheric conflict